In December 2016, 19-year-old Sarah Stern from New Jersey vanished under chilling circumstances. Her abandoned car was discovered the next morning on the Route 35 bridge with the engine running, a scene that initially led some to believe she might have jumped to her death. However, a deeper investigation revealed a far more sinister truth. Sarah's childhood friend, Leah McCatasney, had orchestrated her murder to steal money she had recently inherited. McCatasney, along with accomplice and former roommate Preston Taylor, lured Sarah under the guise of routine familiarity. In a premeditated plot that prosecutors say McCatasney had been planning for months, he strangled Sarah at her home, stole approximately $10,000 from her safe, and then convinced Taylor to help dispose of her body by dumping it into the Shark River through Belmar Bridge. The body itself was never recovered. A break in the case came from a covert recording Anthony Curry, a friend of McCatasney's, secretly captured him admitting, "It took me half an hour to kill her," and chillingly describing it as a timed act, driven by greed. Curry's testimony and the recorded confession formed a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. In February 2019, a jury found McCatasney guilty on 7 counts, including first-degree murder, conspiracy, and desecration of remains. In June 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for desecrating the remains. Preston Taylor, who pled guilty to robbery, conspiracy, disturbing human remains, evidence tampering, and hindering apprehension, testified for the prosecution. As part of his plea deal, the felony murder charge was dropped and he received an 18-year prison sentence, with eligibility for parole after 13 years. At his sentencing, Taylor expressed remorse, but Sarah's father, Michael Stern, expressed deep anguish. "I don't want to hear anything from him." Though Sarah's body was never found, her memory lives on through her father's scholarship in her name and the haunting legacy of a life ended by someone she once considered a friend. Lionel Tate gained significant national and international attention for his involvement in a tragic and controversial criminal case in Florida. On July 28, 1999, when Lionel Tate was 12 years old, he was left unsupervised with his 6-year-old cousin, Tiffany Yunick, at his mother's home in Broward County, Florida. The two children were reportedly playing downstairs while watching a professional wrestling program. Sometime later, Tate informed his mother that Tiffany was not breathing. Paramedics arrived to find Tiffany deceased, and an autopsy revealed numerous severe injuries, including a fractured skull, brain contusions, and multiple bruises, indicative of a brutal beating. Prosecutors alleged that Tate had inflicted these injuries while imitating professional wrestling moves. Tate was indicted and tried as an adult for first-degree murder. In January 2001, at the age of 13, he was convicted of first-degree murder, becoming the youngest American citizen ever sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This mandatory sentence sparked widespread criticism due to his age and the nature of the felony murder rule, under which he was convicted, which did not require proof of intent to kill. The case brought significant debate about the treatment of juvenile offenders in the adult justice system. In December 2003, a state appeals court overturned Tate's conviction, ruling that his mental competency had not been adequately evaluated before trial. This reversal allowed Tate to accept a plea bargain that had initially been offered before his trial, but which he had rejected. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for time served, 3 years in prison, followed by 1 year of house arrest and 10 years of probation. He was released from prison in January 2004. Subsequent arrests and current incarceration freedom was short-lived. In September 2004, he was arrested for carrying a knife with a 4-inch blade, violating his probation. In May 2005, he was arrested again, this time charged with armed robbery and battery after threatening a pizza deliverman with a handgun. He was allowed to withdraw a guilty plea for robbery, but was later sentenced to 30 years in prison in May 2006 for violating his probation. In February 2008, he pleaded no contest to the robbery charge and received a concurrent 10-year sentence. As of current reports, Lionel Tate remains incarcerated at the Hamilton Correctional Institution Annex in Florida, serving his concurrent sentences for second-degree murder as part of his plea deal, probation violation, and armed robbery. Shea Groves, also known as Shea Corrigan, is a British woman convicted of the brutal murder of her on-off boyfriend, Frankie Fitzgerald, in July 2022. The case attracted considerable media attention due to its disturbing details and Groves' alleged fascination with serial killers. In the early hours of July 17, 2022, Groves, then 27, fatally attacked Fitzgerald, 25, as he slept in her bed, slitting his throat and stabbing him numerous times in the chest. Prosecutors argued the motive was a crime of passion driven by jealousy after she discovered messages from a teenage girl on his phone. Groves' defense attempted to argue for self-defense, loss of control, or diminished responsibility, citing an abusive relationship, but these claims were rejected by the jury. A particularly chilling aspect of the trial was the revelation of Groves's macabre fascination with serial killers and true crime documentaries. She had framed pictures of notorious murderers on her walls and was accused of using knowledge from these shows to attempt to cover up and create a false alibi, including manipulating video footage of their consensual BDSM activities to portray herself as a victim of SA. In February 2023, Shea Groves was found guilty of murder at Winchester Crown Court and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years. She is currently serving her sentence in a UK prison. Jessica Kamala Wongso was convicted of murdering her close friend, Wayan Myrna Salihin, in a highly publicized case in Indonesia. On January 6, 2016, the two met at the upscale Olivier Cafe in Jakarta, where Jessica arrived early and was caught on CCTV placing a shopping bag near Myrna's seat. When Myrna arrived and drank the Vietnamese iced coffee that Jessica had ordered for her, she collapsed almost immediately. A toxicology report confirmed that the drink had been laced with a lethal dose of cyanide. Authorities quickly turned their attention to Jessica due to her suspicious behavior captured on camera and her alleged motive, jealousy, and unresolved resentment after Myrna advised her to break off a previous relationship. Jessica was arrested just days later and charged with premeditated murder. Her trial in mid-2016 became a national spectacle, televised live, and followed intensely across Indonesia. On October 27, 2016, she was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. She appealed her conviction, but all attempts were rejected by the High Court and the Supreme Court. After serving 8 years, Jessica was released on parole in August 2024, having received sentence remissions for good behavior. However, her parole terms require her to remain in Jakarta under supervision until 2032. Robert Thompson is a name forever linked to one of the most shocking and widely publicized criminal cases in modern British history, the murder of 2-year-old James Bulger. On February 12, 1993, Thompson, then aged 10, along with his friend John Venables, abducted James Bulger from a shopping center in Bootle, Merseyside. The two boys subjected the toddler to torture and a severe beating during a 2.5-mile journey across Liverpool before leaving his mutilated body on a railway line, where it was subsequently cut in half by a train. Discovered 2 days later, James's body bore 42 injuries, none identifiable as a single fatal blow, indicating extreme suffering. Charged on February 20th, 1993, Thompson and Venables were found guilty of murder on November 24th, 1993, at Preston Crown Court, becoming the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. Their actions described by the judge as unparalleled evil and barbarity. Due to their age, they were sentenced to indefinite detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, and after remaining in custody until age 18, both were released on a lifelong license in June 2001 under new identities, protected by a lifelong court injunction. This decision and the subsequent measures to protect their identities ignited immense public outrage and a sustained media frenzy, fueling an intense national debate about juvenile justice, criminal responsibility, and the possibility of rehabilitation for such young offenders. While Robert Thompson has not been known to reoffend since his release, living a life protected by the injunction, John Venables has repeatedly breached his license conditions, notably for possessing child SA images, and has been recalled to prison multiple times. On July 31st, 2022, 17-year-old MacKenzie Shirilla intentionally crashed her car into a brick wall at 100 miles per hour in Strongsville, Ohio, resulting in the deaths of her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and their friend, Davion Flanagan. Shirilla, who had illegal substances in her system, showed no attempt to brake before the crash. The event was captured on surveillance footage and analyzed through the car's event data recorder, confirming the deliberate nature of the crash. In August 2023, Shirilla was convicted of multiple charges, including murder and aggravated vehicular homicide. The judge described her actions as controlled, methodical, deliberate, intentional, and purposeful, stating, "This was not reckless driving. This was murder." During her arrest, body cam footage revealed Shirilla expressing concern about her bracelet being damaged, displaying a lack of remorse. At her sentencing, she read a statement apologizing to the victims' families, stating, "I hope one day you can see I would never let this happen or do it on purpose. I wish I could remember what happened." Shirilla was sentenced to 2 concurrent 15 years, to life terms, with eligibility for parole after 15 years. The judge noted that, based on her conduct, it was likely she would serve a significant portion of her sentence. Becca Moore is a British woman convicted in November 2024 of the murder of Saket Ali in Sheffield. The 25-year-old played a crucial role in luring 24-year-old Ali to his death in Ponderosa Park in March 2024. Moore made a call to Saket Ali, convincing him to leave a friend's flat and meet her in the park in the early hours of the morning, under the false pretense of offering him drugs and to sleep with him. This was a setup as two teenagers, Barney Griffin, 18, and Jack Douglas, 17 at the time of the murder, then ambushed and brutally stabbed Ollie multiple times with machetes. Ollie reportedly begged for them to stop before his attackers fled, leaving him to die. The court heard that the murder was part of a drug-dealing turf war, with Griffin and Douglas involved in a rival drug line. Moore, who was a drug user and S-worker, was described as being closely allied to dealers. She was found guilty of murder after a 16-day trial at Sheffield Crown Court, while Griffin and Douglas had already pleaded guilty to murder and possession of a bladed article. In November 2024, Rebecca Moore was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Michael Bruce Ross was an American serial killer known as the Roadside Strangler, who murdered at least 8 young women and girls in Connecticut and New York between 1981 and 1984. His execution on May 13, 2005, marked him as the last person to be executed in Connecticut before the state formally ended capital punishment. Born in 1959, Ross was highly intelligent, graduating from Cornell University, but harbored deep-seated violent tendencies linked to a troubled past. Between 1981 and 1984, he confessed to killing 8 women, typically abducting and strangling his victims from roadsides. He was arrested in 1984 after a botched abduction. Sentenced to death in 1987, he spent nearly 18 years on death row. Notably, Ross later chose to end his appeals, believing he found forgiveness through his Catholic faith and wishing to spare victims' families further pain, sparking intense legal debate about his competency. On May 13, 2005, Michael Bruce Ross was executed by lethal injection at Osborne Correctional Institution in Somers, Connecticut. He had spent his final hours with visitors including his father, friends, and lawyers, reportedly reaffirming his decision to die. Throughout his last day, he was described as calm, even receiving Holy Eucharist from a priest. Ross declined a special last meal. Instead, he ate the standard prison meal of the day: turkey a la king with rice, mixed vegetables, white bread, fruit, and a beverage. This choice, some believed, was to avoid further taunting his victims' families. His execution was fraught with numerous last-minute legal challenges and stays, largely stemming from arguments over his competency to waive appeals. However, all these efforts were ultimately denied by the U.S. Supreme Court, paving the way for the execution. When asked if he wished to make a last statement in the death chamber, Ross quietly replied, "No thank you," without opening his eyes. He was pronounced dead at 2:25 a.m., making him the first and only person executed by lethal injection in Connecticut and the state's first execution since 1960. A letter from Ross dated May 10, 2005, and received by a psychiatrist after his death, chillingly read, "Check and mate. You never had a chance." His execution brought a contentious end to a long legal battle and marked a significant point in Connecticut's death penalty history. Amarjeet Sada, in the rural village of Mushahar, Bihar, India, an 8-year-old boy who would soon earn the grim title of being one of the youngest serial killers in history. His victims? Other innocent children, including members of his own family. Amarjeet Sada's story begins in a family plagued by poverty and illiteracy. The Sada family lived on the fringes of society, struggling to make ends meet. Amarjeet's first victim was his 6-month-old cousin, whom he strangled and bludgeoned to death. Incredibly, they chose not to report it to authorities, dismissing it as a tragic accident. His second victim followed shortly after, his own infant sister. Again, the family buried the truth, shielding Amarjeet from punishment. But his reign of terror didn't end there. In 2007, he lured another victim, a 6-month-old baby named Khushbu, into a field. When the child's parents left her momentarily unattended at a school, Amarjeet seized the opportunity. He strangled the infant and crushed her head with a stone. Khushbu's disappearance set the village into a frenzy. When her lifeless body was discovered, the police launched an immediate investigation. Witnesses reported seeing Amarjeet with the baby shortly before her death. When confronted by authorities, the boy confessed without hesitation, speaking with an unsettling calmness. According to reports, he even smiled as he described the murders. His chilling words revealed a lack of remorse, as if he didn't fully grasp the gravity of his actions. Experts suggested Amarjeet might suffer from a psychological disorder, but the exact cause of his behavior remained elusive. At just 8 years old, he was too young to be tried as an adult. The law mandated that children under 18 could only be sent to a juvenile home for a maximum of 3 years, regardless of the crime. Amarjeet was placed in a juvenile detention facility, where he underwent counseling and rehabilitation efforts. However, the limited time frame of his sentence left many fearing what would happen once he was released. After serving his time, Amarjeet Sada was released back into society. Due to strict privacy laws protecting juveniles, little is known about his current whereabouts or identity. Some reports suggesting he was given a new name and relocated to another part of India. The murder of Michelle Yvette Missy Avila, an American teenager, occurred in October 1985 at the hands of her former best friends, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle. The primary reasons for the murder stem from intense jealousy, particularly from Severson, who reportedly became envious of Avila's growing popularity and physical attractiveness. Both Severson and Doyle also accused Avila of having romantic relationships with their boyfriends, fueling their resentment. The events leading to her death began on October 1st, 1985, when Michelle Avila went out with Laura Doyle. 3 days later, on October 4th, 1985, Avila's body was tragically discovered in Big Tahunga Canyon, located within the Angeles National Forest. Forensic examination revealed that she had been forcibly drowned in just 6 inches of water. Additionally, her hair had been cut, and a 4-foot-long log was placed on her body, presumably to keep her submerged. Initially, the investigation faced significant challenges. Law enforcement had no immediate leads, and as a result, the case went cold for nearly 3 years. However, a crucial breakthrough occurred in July 1988 when Eva Kairumbalo came forward with vital information. Her testimony provided the necessary details to reopen the case and directly led to the arrest of Karen Severson and Laura Doyle. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors outlined their case, explaining that Severson and Doyle had lured Avila to a secluded creek. There, they confronted her about what they perceived as her promiscuity and accused her of ruining their relationships. The confrontation escalated violently, with the 2 perpetrators physically holding Avila's face down in the water. To ensure she remained submerged and to prevent her from surfacing, they placed a heavy log on her body. In March 1990, both Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury's decision for a second-degree conviction, rather than first-degree, indicated that they did not believe the murder was premeditated or planned in advance, but rather occurred in the heat of the moment. As a consequence of their conviction, both women were sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Karen Severson was eventually released in December 2011, having served approximately 21 and a half years of her sentence. Laura Doyle followed a year later, being released in December 2012 after serving 22 years. Scarlet Blake is a British transgender woman who was convicted of murder in February 2024 for the killing of Jorge Martin Carreno in Oxford in July 2021. Her case is particularly disturbing due to her demonstrated fixation with violence and with knowing what it would be like to kill someone, as described by the prosecution. 4 months prior to the murder, Blake live-streamed herself brutally killing and dissecting a cat, an act she reportedly engaged in after watching a Netflix documentary about a serial killer who targeted animals. On the night of the murder, Blake, then 26, deliberately targeted 30-year-old Mr. Carreno as he walked home after a night out. She led him to a secluded area near the River Charwell, where she attacked and strangled him before pushing him into the river, causing him to drown. The investigation was complex, taking 2 years for Blake to be identified through CCTV footage. Once arrested, forensic and medical evidence, including DNA on a vodka bottle found at the scene and pathology results consistent with strangulation, helped secure her conviction. The court heard that Blake had an extreme interest in death and harm and sought gratification from violence. She had boasted about the cat killing and expressed a desire to open up a person like her little cat friend. The judge stated that her decision to kill was premeditated and not a momentary mistake, being the culmination of a plan she had been considering for months, partly motivated by a desire to please a former online partner. Scarlet Blake pleaded guilty to criminal damage and animal cruelty related to the cat's death, but denied murder. However, a jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. Derek and Alex King. On a quiet November night in 2001, the small town of Cantonment, Florida, was shattered by a crime that seemed ripped straight from a dark thriller. Inside a modest brick home, the lifeless body of 40-year-old Terry King was discovered. His skull was brutally crushed, and the house had been set ablaze in an apparent attempt to erase the evidence. It was the shocking revelation that the perpetrators were none other than Terry's own sons, 13-year-old Derek and 12-year-old Alex King. Terry King was a single father trying to provide a stable life for his 2 sons after gaining custody of them just months earlier. Described as strict but loving, he was doing his best to raise Derek and Alex in a disciplined environment. However, the boys felt trapped under his rules. On November 26, 2001, their frustrations boiled over. In a shocking confession, Derek admitted to sneaking into his father's room while he slept and striking him repeatedly with a baseball bat. Meanwhile, Alex, the younger brother, allegedly watched from a distance. After their father lay motionless, the boys set the house on fire and fled into the night. The details of the crime were almost too horrifying to comprehend. When investigators first arrived at the scene, they suspected arson. But as they combed through the charred remains, the evidence pointed to something far more sinister. Terry's injuries indicated he had been bludgeoned to death before the fire. The boys were nowhere to be found, sparking a frantic search. A breakthrough came when Derek and Alex turned themselves in days later. During questioning, they shocked detectives by implicating another figure, Ricky Chavez, a 40-year-old family acquaintance with a criminal record. Chavez had allegedly been a mentor and protector to the boys, but investigators soon learned that his relationship with them was far from innocent. The boys claimed that Chavez had encouraged them to kill their father and had even provided them refuge after the crime. Chavez was arrested and charged with accessory to murder, as well as lewd and lascivious acts involving Alex. The case grew even more tangled as the boys' stories shifted, leaving the jury and the public struggling to untangle the truth. The trial of Derek and Alex King captivated the nation. Prosecutors painted a picture of two boys driven by rebellion and anger, while the defense argued that the brothers were victims of Chavez's manipulation. In 2002, Derek and Alex were convicted of second-degree murder and arson. Derek was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Alex received 7 years. Meanwhile, Chavez faced his own legal battles, ultimately being convicted on charges of SA, but acquitted of accessory to murder. After serving their sentences, Derek and Alex King were released in the late 2000s and have largely kept out of the public eye. Danny Rolling, known as the Gainesville Ripper, was an American serial killer responsible for a terrifying crime spree in Gainesville, Florida in 1990 and earlier homicides in Louisiana. Born in 1954, Rolling's abusive childhood contributed to his disturbed mental state. Before the Gainesville murders, he shot his father in Louisiana before fleeing. His crime spree began in November 1989 in Shreveport, Louisiana, with a triple homicide. In August 1990, he escalated his violence in Gainesville, Florida, murdering 5 college students over 4 days, often involving brutal stabbings, SA mutilation, and posing of the bodies. Rolling was arrested for robbery in September 1990 and later linked to the serial killings through DNA and his own incriminating audio diaries. In 1994, he pleaded guilty to the Gainesville murders and was sentenced to death. On October 25, 2006, Danny Rolling spent his final hours on death row at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. He was described as calm and resigned throughout the day. He received visits from his brother, Kevin, and his spiritual advisor, Michael R. Bray. For his last meal, Danny Rolling requested a specific and hearty menu: lobster tail, butterfly shrimp, a baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, and sweet tea. He reportedly ate it without issue. As the hour of his execution approached, he was moved to the execution chamber and calmly strapped to the gurney, with 4 lines inserted. In those final moments, with witnesses present, Rolling did not give a lengthy statement. Instead, he began to sing a religious hymn, "None Greater Than Thee," quietly repeating the refrain, "None greater than thee. O Lord, none greater than thee." His microphone was cut off as he sang. He was executed by lethal injection at 6:00 p.m. The drugs took effect quickly, and he was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. at the age of 52. Shortly before his execution, Rolling also provided a handwritten confession to the Shreveport murders, crimes for which he had long been suspected, but was never formally tried. Sharon Carr, also known by the chilling moniker The Devil's Daughter, is one of the most infamous and youngest female murderers in UK history. Born in 1979, she committed her first known murder in June 1992, at the age of just 12, when she randomly stabbed 18-year-old Katie Ratcliffe to death as Ratcliffe walked home from a nightclub in Camberley, Surrey. The attack was incredibly brutal, with Ratcliffe suffering 32 stab wounds to her body, including her heart and organs, and her jewelry was stolen. The murder initially went unsolved, with police at the time believing an adult male was responsible due to the extreme violence and perceived SA. Carr's involvement in Ratcliffe's murder only came to light in June 1994, when, at the age of 14, she attacked and stabbed another pupil at Collingwood College Comprehensive School for no apparent reason. Following this incident, she began boasting about Ratcliffe's murder to friends and family, and even detailed it in diary entries made while in prison. She had also previously told officers, after an earlier arrest for not returning home, that she enjoyed stabbing cats and had beheaded a dog. She was convicted of Katie Ratcliffe's murder in 1997, a case that attracted significant media attention due to her incredibly young age and the sheer brutality of the killing. She was ordered to serve a minimum of 14 years in prison. However, despite her minimum tariff having expired, Sharon Carr has remained imprisoned due to her continued disruptive and violent behavior within the prison system. She has reportedly continued to attack and attempt to kill staff members and fellow inmates, and has consistently expressed a desire to kill others. As of August 2023, she was again denied parole, continuing to be deemed a danger to the public. Jasmine Richardson became notorious in Canada for her involvement in the horrific murders of her own family members in 2006. At just 12 years old, Jasmine, along with her 23-year-old boyfriend Jeremy Steinke, planned and carried out the killings of her parents, Mark and Deborah, and her 8-year-old brother, Jacob, in their home in Medicine Hat, Alberta. The motive for the murders was primarily attributed to the parents' disapproval of Jasmine's relationship with Steinke. On April 23, 2006, Steinke, allegedly with Jasmine's assistance, entered the Richardson home and brutally stabbed her parents to death in the basement. Jacob was also found dead upstairs from multiple stab wounds, with some accounts suggesting Jasmine herself participated in his death. Jasmine Richardson was tried as a youth under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, and in July 2007, was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She received the maximum sentence for a youth offender of her age, a 10-year intensive rehabilitative custody and supervision sentence. This included time in a psychiatric institution and conditional supervision in the community. The case garnered immense national and international attention due to the extreme youth of the perpetrator and the heinous nature of the crime. Jasmine Richardson completed her 10-year sentence and was released from all court-ordered conditions in May 2016. In August 2013, 20-year-old Renee Marsden, a young woman described by loved ones as fun-loving, bubbly, and honest, tragically ended her life by jumping from a cliff at Watson's Bay in Sydney. What appeared to be a heartbreaking suicide soon revealed itself to be the result of an insidious catfishing campaign. Renee had been emotionally entangled for nearly 2 years with a fabricated persona, Braden Spiteri, purportedly a prisoner in Goulburn jail. Over 11,000 text messages had been exchanged, along with wedding plans, phone bills, and even a tattoo of his name. A coronial inquest later confirmed that Camila Zaydan, Renee's former close friend and ex-girlfriend, had orchestrated the deception. Zaydan used the alias Braden to construct a relationship that manipulated Renee's emotions and eroded her mental well-being. The coroner condemned Zaydan's actions as a profound betrayal, nothing but a pack of lies, and highlighted her repeated dishonesty during the inquiry. Evidence presented during the inquest revealed disturbing signs of emotional abuse, including threats like, "I'll hunt you down," screenshots of messages, and testimony that Zaydan had physically harassed Renee and followed her when she began dating someone else. Despite this, catfishing remains a legal gray area in New South Wales, and Zaydan was not charged criminally. The coroner recommended further legal review, prompting Renee's parents, Mark and Teresa, to campaign for a so-called Renee's Law to criminalize coercive online deception. Sabrina Kouider is a French woman who, along with her partner Wissam Madouni, was convicted in 2018 of the horrific murder and torture of their 21-year-old French nanny, Sophie Lionel. The case was deeply disturbing due to the prolonged suffering inflicted upon the victim and the delusional motive behind the crime. Kouider, described as having an unhealthy, myopic, all-consuming, and groundless obsession, became convinced that Sophie Lionel was conspiring with her former boyfriend, Mark Walton, a founding member of the Irish boy band Boyzone. Despite Lionel and Walton never having met, Kouider, with Madouni's help, subjected the young nanny to weeks, if not months, of starvation, beatings, and torture in an attempt to force her to confess to false accusations, which they even recorded. In September 2017, after prolonged abuse that left her with 5 fractured ribs and a cracked breastbone, Sophie Lionel was brutally killed in the bathtub of their South London home. To cover up their crime, Kouider and Madouni then burned her body on a bonfire in their garden. When neighbors reported the pungent smoke, Madouni attempted to claim the charred remains were those of a sheep. Both Kouider and Madouni denied murder, blaming each other for the death, but admitted to perverting the course of justice by disposing of the body. In May 2018, a jury at the Old Bailey found them both guilty of murder. In June 2018, Sabrina Kouider and Wissam Madouni were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. Gary Ray Bowles, also known as the I-95 Killer, was an American serial killer who murdered 6 men across Florida, Georgia, and Maryland in 1994. He predominantly targeted older gay men, often leaving a signature of stuffing objects down their throats. Born on January 25, 1962, Bowles had a troubled upbringing marked by an abusive stepfather and early substance use. He had a history of arrests for assault and robbery. After being released from prison in 1991, he moved to Daytona Beach, continued to work as a worker, and reportedly developed anger towards gay men after a breakup with his girlfriend, whom he blamed on his sex work. Bowles' murder spree spanned from March to November 1994. He typically befriended his victims before beating and strangling them, then stealing their credit cards. Bowles was arrested on November 22, 1994, in Jacksonville Beach, Florida, after being added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He confessed to all 6 murders. In May 1996, he pleaded guilty to Walter Hinton's murder, receiving a death sentence. Despite a brief reversal, he was again sentenced to death in 1999 for Hinton's murder, and also pleaded guilty to 2 other murders, receiving life sentences. On August 22, 2019, Gary Ray Bowles was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He had woken up at 4:30 a.m. and reportedly was in good spirits earlier in the day. He did not have any family members or a spiritual advisor visit him on his last day, only his attorney. For his last meal, Bowles ordered 3 cheeseburgers, French fries, and bacon. His execution was delayed several hours while the U.S. Supreme Court considered a last-minute appeal, which ultimately failed. When asked for a final statement, Bowles provided a handwritten note saying, "I am so very sorry to all of the family and friends of Mr. Hinton. I never wanted to kill him, and I'm sorry for all of the pain and suffering I have caused." He was pronounced dead at 10:58 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, at the age of 57. On the evening of July 31, 2018, in Gateshead, England, friends Daniel Smith, age 20 and already a father, and Jonathan Carr, 21, were drinking and using substances at Jonathan's flat along with Daniel's cousin, Stephen Morrison. A disagreement erupted between Daniel and Jonathan, during which Daniel became aggressive following a punch thrown outside. In a sudden and violent escalation, Smith seized a kitchen knife and stabbed Jonathan in the chest. Jonathan died from the wound, leaving Daniel to flee the scene by nightfall. The next morning, overwhelmed by guilt, Daniel confessed to his mother that he might have stabbed Jonathan. He accompanied her to Jonathan's flat, and law enforcement gained entry to discover Jonathan dead. Daniel then voluntarily surrendered at a police station. The case quickly progressed to Newcastle Crown Court, where prosecutors dismissed Daniel's claim of self-defense as insufficient given the fatal nature of his actions. In December 2018, after just 2 hours of jury deliberation, Daniel Smith was convicted of murder. The bench sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before parole eligibility. Danny Preddy is widely known in the United Kingdom for his involvement, alongside his elder brother Ricky Preddy, in the high-profile and tragic killing of 10-year-old Damilola Taylor. On November 27, 2000, Damilola Taylor, a Nigerian schoolboy who had recently moved to London with his family, was attacked while walking home from Peckham Library. He was stabbed in the thigh with a broken glass bottle, severing an artery, and was found bleeding to death in a stairwell of a South London housing estate. The incident shocked Britain and led to a massive police investigation, Operation Seal. Danny Preddy, who was 12 at the time, and his brother Ricky, 13, were identified as suspects early on. They were members of a local street gang, the Young Peckham Boys, and had a history of involvement with authorities for violent and criminal behavior. However, crucial forensic evidence was initially missed by forensic scientists, and errors were made in focusing on an unreliable witness, leading to the acquittal of 4 other youths in a 2002 trial. The case was reopened, and new DNA techniques played a critical role. A re-examination of clothing seized at the time revealed Damilola's blood on Danny Preddy's trainers and fibers from Damilola's jumper embedded in the blood, as well as blood traces on Ricky Preddy's sweatshirt. This new forensic evidence led to fresh arrests in 2005. Danny and Ricky Preddy, along with Hassan Jihad, were charged with manslaughter. After a second trial in 2006, Hassan Jihad was acquitted, and the jury could not reach a verdict on the Preddy brothers. A third trial commenced in June 2006, and in August 2006, Danny and Ricky Preddy were finally convicted of Damilola Taylor's manslaughter, nearly 6 years after the crime. Danny and Ricky Preddy were sentenced to 8 years in youth custody. Their conviction brought a sense of justice for Damilola's parents, Richard and Gloria Taylor, who had tirelessly campaigned for answers. However, the case continued to highlight systemic failures in the justice system, including the initial missed evidence and the fact that both brothers were on bail or under supervision at the time of Damilola's death. Both brothers were eventually released from custody after serving parts of their sentences, but their post-release lives have seen further brushes with the law. Ricky Preddy, in particular, has been recalled to prison multiple times for breaching his license conditions. including for violent offenses and associating with gang members. Ted Bundy was a charming yet notorious American serial killer, rapist, and kidnapper who confessed to 30 murders of young women and girls across several states between 1974 and 1978, though the true number is believed to be higher. He often used his charisma to lure victims before brutally assaulting and killing them. Born in 1946, Bundy cultivated a seemingly normal facade, even studying law, while secretly escalating his violent impulses. His crime spree stretched across the Pacific Northwest and into Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. After 2 dramatic escapes from custody, he continued his rampage in Florida, committing particularly brutal attacks. Recaptured in 1978, his high-profile trials led to 3 death sentences. He spent a decade on death row, maintaining innocence for years before a flurry of confessions just before his execution. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy spent his final hours on death row at Florida State Prison in Stark. The night before was reportedly filled with crying and prayer as he met with a Methodist minister and had a tearful interview with psychologist James Dobson, where he controversially blamed pornography for his actions. He also made 2 phone calls to his mother to say goodbye. Bundy declined a special last meal. Instead, he was given the standard prison fare: a steak cooked medium rare, eggs over easy, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk, and coffee. However, he did not eat any of it. As the 7 a.m. execution hour arrived, Bundy was led into the execution chamber. He reportedly looked startled as he was strapped into Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair. His head and right leg had been shaved to ensure proper contact with the electrodes. Bundy made no final verbal statement in the chamber. The execution commenced. Thousands gathered outside the prison, creating a carnival-like atmosphere with cheering, chanting, and fireworks, celebrating his impending death. After the switch was pulled, Bundy's body stiffened and pressed against the chair back. He was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. EST at the age of 42. His execution, watched by 42 witnesses, brought a definitive and publicly celebrated end to one of America's most infamous reigns of terror. Stacey Hyde, also known as Anastasia Darlison, is a British woman whose case gained significant attention due to her initial murder conviction at a young age, followed by a successful appeal and acquittal on the grounds of self-defense. In the early hours of September 4, 2009, when she was just 17, Stacey Hyde stabbed and killed Vincent Francis, the 34-year-old boyfriend of her friend, Holly Banwell, at their flat in Wells, Somerset. Hyde claimed she had acted in self-defense and in defense of her friend, as Francis had a history of violence towards women and was attacking Banwell and then Hyde herself at the time. A crucial 999 call made by Banwell during the incident captured screams and her pleas for help. Despite her claims of self-defense and a chaotic childhood marked by abuse and mental health issues, including PTSD, bulimia nervosa, and ADHD, Hyde was initially convicted of murder in March 2010 and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 9 years. She served 5 years in prison, during which time organizations like Justice for Women campaigned on her behalf. In November 2014, the Court of Appeal overturned her murder conviction, ordering a retrial. New evidence, particularly regarding her mental health at the time of the offense and the context of the violence from Francis, played a key role. At the retrial in May 2015 at Winchester Crown Court, a jury acquitted Stacey Hyde of murder, accepting that she had acted in self-defense. She was immediately released from prison. Following her release, Stacey Hyde struggled to adapt to life outside, facing challenges with her mental health, drug, and alcohol abuse. She died suddenly on April 11, 2024, at the age of 32. An inquest concluded that her death was due to natural causes, specifically complications from bulimia nervosa, highlighting the incredibly difficult life she led even after being cleared of murder. Timothy James McVeigh was an American domestic terrorist, singularly responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995. This horrific attack on the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured hundreds more, becoming the deadliest act of homegrown terrorism in U.S. history until 9/11. Born in 1968, McVeigh's anti-government views intensified after the Waco siege and Ruby Ridge incident, which he viewed as government tyranny. Driven by revenge, he meticulously planned the bombing, selecting the 2nd anniversary of the Waco siege as his date. He detonated a massive truck bomb outside the federal building, causing catastrophic destruction. Remarkably, he was pulled over shortly after for a license plate violation and arrested for a concealed weapon, leading to his identification as the bomber. Convicted on 11 counts in 1997, he was sentenced to death. McVeigh famously refused to appeal, stating his desire to proceed with his execution. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh spent his final hours at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, maintaining a remarkably calm and unemotional demeanor. According to prison logs, he woke early, showered, joking to guards when the water ran cold that it was cruel and unusual punishment, and paced his cell. He spent parts of the day watching CNN, though later turned off the TV, remaining restless. For his last meal, McVeigh famously declined a traditional feast, instead requesting and consuming 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. He received final visits from his lawyers and was administered Catholic last rites, despite his professed agnosticism. As the 7 a.m. execution hour approached, McVeigh was moved to the death chamber and calmly strapped to the gurney. He did not offer any verbal last words. Instead, as his final statement, he handed the warden a handwritten copy of the 1875 poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley. The poem, known for its themes of self-mastery and defiance, concludes with "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." The execution by lethal injection commenced. Approximately 200 individuals, including victims' family members and survivors, watched via closed-circuit television in a separate room. McVeigh remained still, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling, until he was pronounced dead at 7:14 a.m. His execution marked the first federal execution in the United States in 38 years, bringing a definitive end to his reign of terror. Bailey Jr. Kurariki is a New Zealander who became infamously known as the youngest person convicted of killing in New Zealand history. Born in 1989, Kurariki was just 12 years old when he was involved in the brutal robbery and killing of pizza delivery man Michael Richard Choi in Papakura, a suburb of Auckland, on September 12, 2001. The incident involved Kurariki and a group of 5 other teenagers, all older than him, who ambushed Choi, attacking him with a baseball bat and robbing him of cash and pizzas. While some of the older members of the group were convicted of murder, Kurariki was convicted of manslaughter, a verdict that reflected his lesser role in the direct causation of death, but still underscored his participation in the violent act. The highly publicized case, which occurred at a time of heightened concern over youth crime in New Zealand, sparked significant public outrage and extensive debate, particularly concerning the culpability of very young offenders and the state's care for children in difficult circumstances. As Kurariki himself had been in the custody of child, youth and family since age 5 and exhibited a long history of behavioral issues. Kurariki was sentenced to 7 years in jail, a term considered lenient by some given the severity of the crime. He was eventually released on parole in May 2008, but his post-release life has been marked by repeated breaches of parole conditions and further criminal activity, including charges of assault, domestic violence, and participation in gang-related activities, notably with the Killer Bees. These numerous reoffenses have led to several stints back in prison, consistently drawing media attention and fueling ongoing public discussion in New Zealand. Tori Lang, affectionately known as Kiwi, was an 18-year-old honor student from Lithonia, Georgia, whose life was tragically cut short in July 2021. Lang had recently graduated from Stevenson High School and was pursuing a degree in architectural engineering. On July 28, 2021, her body was discovered under a tree in Yellow River Park, Gwinnett County, with a gunshot wound to the head. Her car, a 2012 Nissan Versa, was found a week later, burned and abandoned at Hidden Acres Nature Preserve in DeKalb County, approximately 5 miles from the park. Austin Tiber Ford, a 20-year-old man from Lithonia, was arrested and charged with felony murder, aggravated assault, voluntary manslaughter, and other related offenses in connection with Lang's death. Ford, who had been a friend of Lang, was accused of shooting her and then concealing her death by burning her car and abandoning it in a wooded area. The case went to trial twice, with both trials resulting in mistrials due to hung juries unable to reach a unanimous verdict on the murder charges. The defense argued that Lang's death was a suicide, citing the medical examiner's inability to definitively determine the manner of death. However, prosecutors contended that Ford's actions, such as removing the firearm and vehicle from the scene and providing conflicting statements, suggested involvement in her death. Following the mistrials, Ford was convicted on lesser charges, including theft by taking and concealing the death of another. In August 2023, he was sentenced to 20 years, with the first 10 years to be served in prison and the remaining 10 years on probation. Additionally, he was ordered to have no contact with Lang's family. Shauna Hoare is a British woman known for her involvement in the murder of teenager Becky Watts in Bristol in February 2015. She was the girlfriend of Nathan Matthews, Becky's stepbrother, who was ultimately convicted of Becky's murder. The prosecution argued that Matthews and Hoare shared a sexually motivated fantasy about kidnapping teenage girls. On February 19, 2015, they carried out a kidnap plot against 16-year-old Becky Watts at her home. During the abduction, Becky was suffocated by Matthews, suffering over 40 injuries as she fought for her life. Following the murder, Matthews and Hoare transported Becky's body to their own home, where over the next few days, her body was dismembered into 8 pieces using a circular saw and a knife in their bathroom. They then placed the remains into bags and boxes, which were hidden in a neighbor's shed. Hoare's role in the crime was highly contested during the trial. She denied any knowledge of the murder and claimed she was not involved in the dismemberment or disposal of the body. However, the prosecution presented evidence, including CCTV footage of Hoare and Matthews buying cleaning products and a circular saw, and text messages between them discussing kidnapping scenarios. DNA evidence also linked Hoare to items found with Becky's remains. In November 2015, after a 6-week trial, Nathan Matthews was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years. Shauna Hoare was acquitted of murder but convicted of manslaughter, conspiracy to kidnap, perverting the course of justice, and preventing a lawful burial. She was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Shauna Hoare's conviction drew significant public attention, especially given the gruesome nature of Becky Watts' dismemberment. She was released on license in September 2023, having served half of her 17-year sentence, which caused anger and distress among Becky's family. As part of her release conditions, she is reportedly not allowed to return to Bristol. In June 2019, 19-year-old Cynthia Hoffman was brutally murdered in what became one of Alaska's most disturbing criminal cases. Cynthia, who had developmental disabilities, believed she was going on a hike at Thunderbird Falls in Chugiak with her best friend, 18-year-old Denali Bremer, and another teen 16-year-old Caden McIntosh. However, the outing was a premeditated trap. Bremer had been catfished online by a 21-year-old Indiana man named Darren Showmiller, who posed as a wealthy individual named Tyler. He promised Bremer $9 million in exchange for photos and videos of a murder being committed. Motivated by the false promise of money and reportedly jealousy over a boy, Bremer conspired with McIntosh and others, including Caleb Leland, to carry out the killing. On the day of the crime, the teens lured Cynthia off the hiking trail under the pretense of friendship. They bound her with duct tape, and Caden McIntosh shot her execution style in the back of the head. They then dumped her body into the Eklutna River and attempted to destroy evidence by disposing of her belongings in a nearby park. Meanwhile, Bremer took photos and videos of the crime scene and sent them to Showmiller to fulfill his grotesque request. The investigation quickly unraveled the plot after Cynthia's body was discovered and Bremer began to confess details to police. Denali Bremer was charged with first-degree murder, among other counts. She pleaded guilty in February 2023. In addition to state charges, Bremer also faced federal child charges after it was revealed she had taken explicit photos of a minor at Showmiller's request. She was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison in March 2024. Then, in February 2024, an Alaska state judge sentenced her to 99 years in prison without the possibility of parole for Cynthia's murder. Wesley Allen Dodd was an American serial killer and sex offender who murdered 3 young boys in Vancouver, Washington, in 1989. His execution by hanging on January 5, 1993, was notable as the first legal hanging in the United States since 1965, ending a long hiatus for this method of capital punishment. Born in 1961, Dodd had a deeply troubled past marked by a history of child assay, which escalated over the years. Despite repeated arrests for these offenses, he often received minimal punishment. Between September and October 1989, he murdered 11-year-old Cole and 10-year-old Billy Neer and 4-year-old Leah Selly, meticulously documenting his crimes in a diary. He was arrested in November 1989 after a failed abduction attempt and quickly confessed. Dodd famously fought against his own appeals, insisting he deserved to die and would re-offend if spared. He specifically requested to be executed by hanging, the same way his last victim, Leah Selly, had died. On January 5, 1993, Wesley Allen Dodd faced his execution at the state penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. He declined a special last meal, reportedly having only some oatmeal and milk earlier in the day. As the hour of his execution, shortly after midnight, arrived, Dodd was led into the old tannery, which served as the execution site. He was strapped to an antique mahogany chair. Given his specific request, the method of execution was hanging. Witnesses, including family members of his victims and media, were present. Just before the hood and noose were placed, Dodd delivered a brief, unexpected last statement. "I was once asked by somebody, I don't remember who, if there was any way offenders could be stopped. I said no, I was wrong. I was wrong when I said there was no hope, no peace. There is hope. There is peace. I found both in the Lord, Jesus Christ. Look to the Lord and you will find peace." Witnesses reported no visible struggle or suffering after the trapdoor opened and he dropped. Wesley Allen Dodd was pronounced dead at 12:08 a.m. at the age of 31. Teresa Riggi was an American woman who tragically murdered her 3 young children in Edinburgh, Scotland, in August 2010. The act occurred amid a bitter and escalating custody battle with her estranged husband, Pasquale Riggi, an American oil industry executive. In the days leading up to the murders, Teresa Riggi had gone missing with her children, 8-year-old twins Gianluca and Austin, and 5-year-old Cecilia, becoming the subject of a missing persons appeal. Police eventually located them, but tragically on August 4th, 2010, the children were found dead with multiple stab wounds in their Edinburgh flat. Riggi was also discovered severely injured after a gas explosion in the property, and was found to have self-inflicted stab wounds and injuries from jumping or falling from a second-story balcony. Initially charged with murder, Riggi later admitted to culpable homicide, the Scottish equivalent of manslaughter, on the grounds of diminished responsibility in March 2011. Her defense argued that she was suffering from severe personality disorders, including narcissistic paranoid and hysterical traits, alongside acute stress. The court heard that she killed her children to prevent her husband from gaining custody. She was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Teresa Riggi was later transferred from a Scottish prison to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in England, due to her complex mental health issues. She was found dead at Rampton in March 2014, at the age of 49. Her death was not treated as suspicious, with reports suggesting she took her own life. John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, was an American serial killer and sex offender who murdered at least 33 young men and boys in the Chicago area between 1972 and 1978. He buried most of his victims in the crawl space under his suburban home. Born in 1942, Gacy projected an image of a respectable building contractor and community figure, even performing as Pogo the Clown. Beneath this facade, he lured victims to his home, where he raped, tortured, and strangled them. His crimes were uncovered after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Pius led police to his home in 1978, where the horrific discovery of 29 bodies buried on his property shocked the nation. Convicted of 33 murders in 1980, he was sentenced to death. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy faced his execution at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, after 14 years on death row. He reportedly spent his final hours calm and defiant. For his last meal, Gacy famously requested a significant spread, particularly nostalgic for his past as a KFC manager, a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, 12 fried prawns, French fries, a pound of strawberries, and a Diet Coke. As the hour of his execution approached, Gacy was escorted to the execution chamber. He was strapped to a gurney and witnesses, including victims' family members and media, watched. Just moments before the lethal injection began, Gacy spoke his infamous last words, "Kiss my ass." The execution by lethal injection commenced, but it was fraught with a significant and disturbing error. A clog in the line prevented the chemicals from flowing properly, causing an excruciating 18-minute delay before the process was successfully completed. This was roughly 4 times longer than a typical lethal injection. After the chemicals fully administered, Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m. at the age of 52. Outside the prison, nearly 1,000 people gathered, many celebrating and cheering Gacy's death, releasing balloons and carrying signs mocking his clown persona. Eric Smith. In the quiet town of Savona, New York, a nightmare unfolded on a sunny day in August 1993. Eric Smith, a 13-year-old boy with red hair and freckles, seemed to be just another kid trying to navigate the ups and downs of adolescence. He was often described as a loner, a boy who spent much of his time riding his bike or playing alone. It all began when Derek Roby, a cheerful and energetic 4-year-old, left home to walk to a summer recreation program just a block away. Derek's parents, thinking it was safe, allowed him to take the short walk by himself. Derek crossed paths with Eric Smith, and the unthinkable happened. Eric lured Derek into a wooded area, away from the safety of the open street and the eyes of others. There, in an act of unprovoked brutality, Eric attacked the young boy, strangling him and striking him repeatedly with a large rock. He also inflicted other injuries, including stabbing Derek with a stick, an act that added another layer of horror to the crime. The murder was senseless and horrifying. When Derek's parents realized he hadn't arrived at the program, panic set in. They immediately called the authorities, and a search party was quickly organized. Volunteers and police combed the area, their hope fading with each passing hour. Later that day, Derek's lifeless body was discovered in the woods, a mere few hundred yards from his home. The serene town was now a crime scene, and investigators were desperate to find answers. Eric's demeanor during the investigation initially raised no red flags. He even joined the search efforts, mingling with neighbors and consoling Derek's grieving parents. To those around him, Eric seemed genuinely concerned, a young boy shaken by the tragedy. But soon, Eric's behavior became suspicious. He began asking strange questions about the investigation and seemed overly interested in the details of the crime. He also displayed an unusual calmness that didn't align with the shock and grief engulfing the community. When he was brought in for questioning, Eric's calm facade began to crack. He eventually confessed to the murder, shocking everyone who knew him. The trial was harrowing. Eric's defense team painted a picture of a troubled boy who had endured relentless bullying due to his appearance. His bright red hair, thick glasses, and protruding ears made him a target. They argued that years of pent-up anger and frustration had exploded in an uncontrollable act of violence. They also highlighted Eric's struggles with emotional and behavioral issues, including signs of depression and impulsivity. But the prosecution emphasized the cold and calculated nature of the crime, pointing to the way Eric lured Derek, carried out the attack, and then attempted to feign innocence afterward. Despite his age, Eric was tried as an adult and convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 9 years to life in prison. While behind bars, Eric expressed remorse for his actions, claiming he finally understood the pain he had caused. Over the years, he participated in various rehabilitation programs and earned educational qualifications. However, his parole hearings became a source of anguish for Derek's family, who relived their nightmare every time they had to argue against his release. For decades, Eric's bids for freedom were denied. In 2022, nearly 3 decades after the murder, Eric Smith was granted parole and released from prison. Now in his 40s, he has expressed a desire to move on and live a quiet life. Heidi Broussard, a 33-year-old mother from Austin, Texas, was tragically murdered in December 2019 by her longtime friend, Megan Firamusca. Firamusca, 37, had been friends with Broussard for over a decade, having met at church camp. The two women had discussed being pregnant together, even considering the possibility of giving birth on the same day. On December 12, 2019, Broussard dropped off her older child at school and was last seen returning home with her newborn daughter, Margot Carey. Later that day, Firamusca abducted Broussard, strangling her with a dog leash, and placed her body in the trunk of her car. She then drove to her home in the Houston area, where she attempted to pass off the infant as her own. Firamusca had previously convinced friends and family that she was pregnant, despite there being no evidence of an actual pregnancy. The case drew significant public attention, and after an extensive investigation, Firamusca was arrested. In February 2023, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Heidi Broussard and was sentenced to 55 years in prison. As part of the plea agreement, Firamusca waived her right to appeal, bringing some closure to the families involved. In August 2010, Sally Challen, then 56, killed her 61-year-old husband, Richard Challen, by bludgeoning him with a hammer in their Surrey home. She then covered his body and left a note before driving to Beachy Head, intending to take her own life, but was talked down by a chaplain. In June 2011, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years, later reduced to 18 on appeal. Her defense at the original trial was diminished responsibility due to depression, but this was not accepted by the jury, who primarily heard the prosecution portray her as a jealous wife. However, a powerful campaign for her release, championed by her sons David and James, and supported by groups like Justice for Women, highlighted the decades of severe coercive and controlling behavior Richard had inflicted upon Sally. This abuse included financial control, extreme emotional manipulation, isolation from friends and family, constant belittling, infidelity, and even alleged SA. At the time of her original conviction, coercive control was not a specific criminal offense in England and Wales. It became one in 2015, and its full psychological impact on victims was not widely understood or adequately presented in court. In February 2019, the Court of Appeal quashed her murder conviction and ordered a retrial. This decision was based on new psychiatric evidence which showed that Sally was suffering from 2 serious mental disorders, exacerbated by Richard's coercive control, that were not fully explored at her first trial. This was a pivotal moment, as it implicitly acknowledged the profound effect of psychological abuse on her mental state. Following the quashing of the murder conviction, in June 2019, prosecutors at the Old Bailey accepted her plea of guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge, accepting that Richard Challen had controlled, isolated, and humiliated his wife, sentenced her to 9 years and 4 months imprisonment. Crucially, as she had already served this time, Sally Challen was released from prison immediately. Gary Mark Gilmore was an American criminal who gained international notoriety in the 1970s for demanding the implementation of his death sentence. His execution by firing squad on January 17, 1977, ended a de facto nationwide moratorium on capital punishment in the United States that had lasted nearly 10 years, making him the first person executed in the U.S. after the death penalty was reinstated. Born in 1940, Gilmore had a turbulent life with a long history of criminal behavior and extensive time in prison. After his parole in 1976, he quickly resumed a life of crime. In July 1976, he murdered a motel manager and a gas station attendant in cold blood during separate robberies in Utah. He was swiftly arrested when he accidentally shot himself while trying to dispose of the murder weapon. Gilmore was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Crucially, he refused to appeal his sentence, actively fighting against legal efforts to spare his life, and even going on a hunger strike. On January 17, 1977, Gary Mark Gilmore faced his execution at Utah State Prison in Draper. He declined a traditional last meal. Instead, in the hours before his execution, he had a hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, a baked potato, several cups of coffee, and notably, 3 shots of contraband Jack Daniel's whiskey. As he was led into the old tannery, which served as the execution site, Gilmore was strapped to an antique mahogany chair. Given the choice between hanging and firing squad, he had famously chosen the latter, deeming it less messy. He appeared calm and defiant. When asked for any final words, Gilmore delivered his iconic statement to the firing squad, "Let's do it." He also reportedly uttered Dominus Vobiscum, Latin for "the Lord be with you," just before the shots. 5 marksmen, volunteers from local police departments, with live rounds, one with a blank, fired simultaneously through a screen, aiming at a target pinned over Gilmore's heart. Gilmore's body convulsed and he was pronounced dead at 8:08 a.m. His death, which he had actively sought, ended a nearly decade-long pause in executions in the United States, cementing his place in the history of capital punishment. Martine Vik Magnussen was a 23-year-old Norwegian business student whose tragic death in London in March 2008 remains unresolved. On the night of March 14, 2008, Martine was last seen leaving the exclusive Maddox nightclub in Mayfair with Farouk Abdulhak, a fellow student at Regent's Business School and the son of a wealthy Yemeni family. Her body was discovered 2 days later, hidden under rubble in the basement of Abdulhak's apartment building on Great Portland Street. A post-mortem examination revealed that she had been and strangled. Abdulhak fled the UK shortly after her death, first traveling to Egypt and then to Yemen, where he remains beyond the reach of British authorities due to the lack of an extradition treaty between the UK and Yemen. In March 2023, Abdulhak communicated with BBC journalist Nawal Al-Maghafi, stating that Martine's death was the result of a sex accident gone wrong. He expressed regret over the incident but has not returned to the UK to face justice. Despite an international arrest warrant and efforts by Martine's family and British authorities, Abdulhak remains at large. Martine's father, Odd Petter Magnussen, has tirelessly campaigned for justice, appealing to the UK government and international bodies to secure his daughter's killer's extradition. He has highlighted how wealth and political influence can obstruct justice, emphasizing the need for accountability regardless of the perpetrator's status. Carlton Michael Gary, known as the Stocking Strangler, was an American serial killer convicted of murdering 3 elderly women in Columbus, Georgia, between 1977 and 1978. He was also linked to other attacks and murders. Born in 1950, Gary had a troubled past marked by a history of arrests and abuse. Between 1977 and 1978, he attacked and strangled 7 elderly women, often using their own stockings, though he was convicted for 3 murders. He was arrested in 1984 after new evidence, including fingerprints and a stolen gun, linked him to the crimes. Convicted in 1986, he was sentenced to death. Gary spent over 30 years on death row, maintaining his innocence through numerous appeals. On March 15, 2018, Carlton Michael Gary was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson, Georgia. He declined a special last meal. Instead, he received the standard institutional tray, which included a grilled hamburger, hot dog, white beans, coleslaw, and grape drink. Gary did not offer a final prayer or make a final statement in the death chamber. He had given an interview hours before his execution, continuing to maintain his innocence. His execution was delayed for several hours due to last-minute appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, which were ultimately denied. When the injection began, Gary reportedly showed very little movement, eventually exhibiting rapid chest movements and fluttering lips before being pronounced dead at 10:33 p.m. at the age of 67. Virginia McCullough is a British woman convicted of the double murder of her parents, John and Lois McCullough, in a deeply disturbing case that came to light in 2023, though the murders themselves occurred in June 2019. McCullough, who was living rent-free with her retired parents in Great Baddow, Essex, had accumulated significant debt, nearly £60,000, in their names, forging documents and inventing elaborate stories to cover her tracks and explain financial losses. Driven by a desire to prevent her parents from discovering the extent of her fraud and continue benefiting from their finances, she meticulously planned their murders over several months. She first poisoned her father, John McCullough, 70, by crushing prescription medication into his alcoholic drinks, which proved fatal. The following day, her mother, Lois McCullough, 71, who had not consumed a fatal dose of the poison, was beaten with a hammer and fatally stabbed multiple times. McCullough then went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the bodies for 4 years, creating a makeshift mausoleum for her father using breeze blocks and sleeping bags in his study, and wrapping her mother's body in a sleeping bag and hiding it in an upstairs wardrobe. During these 4 years, she continued to live in the house alongside their remains, maintaining an elaborate, extensive, and enduring web of deceit. She collected their state pensions, spent their money, accrued more debt in their names, and frequently lied to family, friends, and doctors about her parents' whereabouts, claiming they were unwell, on holiday, or traveling. The deception eventually unraveled in September 2023 when a concerned GP alerted Essex police after not hearing from John and Lois for some time. When officers forced entry into the home, McCullough immediately confessed to the murders, reportedly telling officers, "I didn't know that this day would come eventually, and cheer up, at least you've caught the bad guy." In June 2024, Virginia McCullough pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder at Chelmsford Crown Court. In October 2024, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years. Gemma Mitchell is a British former osteopath convicted in October 2022 of the shocking murder of her friend, 67-year-old Mikun Chong, also known as Deborah. Mitchell's motive was financial gain, as she had hoped to inherit a substantial portion of Chong's £700,000 estate after Chong withdrew an offer of financial help for a property renovation Mitchell was undertaking. The murder occurred at Chong's home in Wembley, London, on June 11, 2021. After killing Chong, Mitchell meticulously placed her decapitated body into a large suitcase. 2 weeks later, she hired a car and drove over 200 miles to Salcombe, Devon, where she dumped the headless remains in woodland. The discovery of Chong's body by holidaymakers in June 2021 launched a major investigation. Evidence presented at trial included CCTV footage showing Mitchell transporting the heavy suitcase, as well as the discovery of a forged will at Mitchell's home that would have left 95% of Chong's assets to Mitchell. Her background in human sciences and osteopathy, including experience with human dissection, was highlighted during the trial, as it was suggested this knowledge may have aided her in dismembering the body. Gemma Mitchell was found guilty of murder, and her sentencing in October 2022 at the Old Bailey was notable for being the first time a murder conviction's sentencing phase was televised in England and Wales, and the first televised sentencing of a woman in the UK. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years. In March 2015, 18-year-old Brittany Gargle was found strangled to death near a landfill outside Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Her best friend, 21-year-old Cheyenne Rose Antoine, became the prime suspect. Crucially, police discovered Brittany's body alongside a belt, the very same belt Cheyenne was wearing in a selfie posted on Facebook just hours before the tragedy. This tiny but telling detail unraveled Antoine's initial alibi. She had claimed they parted ways after visiting bars, while Brittany went with another man, but the Facebook evidence placed her at the scene with the murder weapon. Investigators reconstructed the night's events using social media timelines and a crucial tip. Cheyenne allegedly confessed to a friend in the early hours, admitting that she had hit and strangled Brittany following an alcohol-fueled argument. After initially facing second-degree murder charges, she ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a 7-year prison sentence in January 2018. During sentencing, defense lawyers highlighted her troubled upbringing, including foster care and abuse, while the Crown emphasized her deliberate efforts to mislead investigators, including false alibis and social media manipulation. Emma Jane Magson is a British woman who was convicted of the murder of her partner, James Knight, in March 2016. The crime occurred at her home in Leicester following a drunken argument. Magson stabbed Knight once in the heart with a steak knife, causing a fatal wound. Her case became particularly notable because her initial conviction in November 2016 led to a life sentence with a minimum term of 17 years. However, her conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in January 2020, and a retrial was ordered. This decision was largely influenced by new psychiatric evidence that suggested the defense of diminished responsibility would have been available to her at her first trial. Campaign groups, such as Justice for Women, supported her appeal, arguing that her mental health issues and experiences within an abusive relationship were not adequately considered. At her second trial in March 2021, held at Birmingham Crown Court, a jury again found her guilty of James Knight's murder by a majority verdict. The prosecution highlighted her actions after the stabbing, including misleading 999 operators and others about the nature of Knight's injuries, and delaying calling for help. Despite her claims of self-defense, arguing that Knight had been aggressive and had grabbed her by the throat, the jury rejected this. She was subsequently resentenced to life imprisonment with the same minimum term of 17 years. On November 20th, 2015, in the Wakefield neighborhood of the Bronx, Ashley Wade, then 22, invited her longtime friend Angelique Sutton, who was approximately 8.5 months pregnant and on her wedding day, to her apartment under the pretense of giving her a gift. When Sutton arrived, Wade brutally attacked her, slashing her throat and repeatedly stabbing her neck and abdomen to prevent her from yelling for help. After fatally wounding Sutton, Wade surgically removed the unborn baby using a 3-inch knife and wrapped the newborn in a blanket, claiming the child as her own. The infant, later named Genesis Bradley by the victim's family, survived and was present in court when Wade was sentenced. Following a graphic and highly publicized trial in early October 2017, during which prosecutors presented intense photographic evidence and testimony from medical experts diagnosing Wade with pseudocyesis, a psychological condition where a person believes they are pregnant, she was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping. In November 2017, Judge Margaret Clancy sentenced Wade to 25 years to life for murder, plus an additional 15 years for kidnapping, to be served consecutively, resulting in a total sentence of 40 years to life in prison. The case devastated both families and shocked the nation, with a candlelit vigil held in Sutton's memory where loved ones described her as always so joyful and laughing. During sentencing, prosecutors emphasized the calculated nature of the crime, noting that Wade meticulously planned the murder on her friend's wedding day, went to great lengths to disguise her own deception, and attempted to steal an infant for personal gain. Today, Genesis lives with Sutton's relatives, a living testament to the tragic loss and an enduring bond between mother and child. Ashana Studholme is a British woman convicted in December 2023 of the horrific murder of Shakira Spencer. Her case, alongside co-defendants Sean Pendlebury and Lisa Richardson, revealed a prolonged period of sadistic torture and control over their vulnerable victim. The court heard that Studholme, along with Pendlebury and Richardson, subjected Shakira Spencer, 35, to a campaign of extreme physical and psychological abuse over several months. Spencer, described as vulnerable and easily exploited, was treated like a slave, isolated from her family and friends, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. This included being starved, reportedly fed only ketchup sachets, beaten, having her feet scalded with hot water, and burned with a flame. They also controlled her finances and forced her to run errands and clean their homes. The abuse culminated in a frenzied, violent assault between September 9th and 12th, 2022. After being brutally beaten to the brink of death at Studholme's flat, Spencer was driven back to her own home in the boot of Studholme's car. In a truly unfathomable evil act, she was locked in a hallway cupboard and left to die alone. Her badly decomposed body was discovered 2 weeks later, in September 2022, after neighbors reported maggots crawling from under her front door. During the trial, video footage filmed by the defendants themselves, mobile phone evidence, and forensic analysis were used to prove their involvement. Messages and videos mocking Spencer and showing her being beaten were found on their phones. In March 2024, Ashana Studholme, Sean Pendlebury, and Lisa Richardson were each sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years at the Old Bailey for murder and preventing the lawful burial of Shakira Spencer. Yasmin Martin, a 19-year-old from Sunderland, England, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for causing the death of her close friend, Mia Marsh, through dangerous driving. The incident occurred on December 2nd, 2022, when Martin, who had consumed alcohol and was nearly double the legal drink-drive limit, drove a Vauxhall Astra she had never driven before. She was taking 3 friends home after a night out in Sunderland. Despite pleas from passengers, including Mia, to slow down, Martin accelerated, reaching speeds of over 70 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour zone. She lost control on a bend and crashed into a crash barrier, resulting in Mia's death from a significant head injury. None of the passengers were wearing seatbelts at the time. Martin initially claimed her drink had been spiked, but later admitted to her actions. In addition to her prison sentence, Martin was banned from driving for 5 years upon release. Mia's family expressed profound grief, describing the loss as unimaginable and noting that Mia's injuries were so severe that a closed coffin was required for her funeral. The murder of 16-year-old Jason Sweeney, a construction worker from Philadelphia, occurred on May 30th, 2003. He was brutally killed by 4 teenagers, including his own girlfriend and best friend, with the primary motive being to steal his paycheck. This violent crime, involving young perpetrators who showed little remorse, drew significant national attention. The incident began when Justina Morley, Sweeney's 15-year-old girlfriend, lured him to a wooded area known as the Trails near the Delaware River, pretending it was a date. Unbeknownst to Sweeney, Morley had been involved with two 16-year-olds, Nicholas Kouider and Edward Batzig Jr., with Batzig also being Sweeney's best friend. Nicholas's 17-year-old brother, Dominic Kouider, was also part of the plan. Once Sweeney arrived, Batzig started the attack, repeatedly hitting Sweeney in the head. The Kouider brothers and Batzig then continued the brutal attack, striking Sweeney with a hatchet, a hammer, and a rock until he died. As a final horrific act, they dropped a large boulder on his head. After the murder, they stole his $500 paycheck, shared a group hug, and then used the stolen money to buy jewelry and drugs. The police investigation revealed that the murder was not a spontaneous act, but had been planned days in advance. The group even listened to the Beatles' song, Helter Skelter, repeatedly as part of their preparation for the crime. Joshua Staub, a friend of Dominic Kouider, testified that the group had bragged about their plan to kill Sweeney, using Morley as bait, and that Batzig knew Sweeney would have his paycheck on him. Although the perpetrators were known to be addicts, they were sober at the time of the murder. A detective and a forensic psychologist later suggested that envy and resentment of Sweeney's success might have been additional motives beyond just the robbery. In terms of legal proceedings and sentencing, Justina Morley pleaded guilty to third-degree murder in exchange for her testimony against the others. She was sentenced to 17.5 to 35 years in prison and was released on parole in December 2020. Dominic Kouider, Nicholas Kouider, and Edward Batzig Jr. were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, robbery, and possessing an instrument of crime. They were tried as adults and were all convicted in May 2005. Each received mandatory life sentences without parole for the murder charge, along with additional years for the other crimes. None of the teenagers showed any remorse at their sentencing. Due to a 2012 Supreme Court ruling regarding juvenile offenders, Nicholas Kouider and Edward Batzig Jr. were granted resentencing hearings. However, in 2015, Nicholas Kouider's original sentence of life without parole was upheld. Glenn Edward Rogers, known as the Cross-Country Killer or the Casanova Killer, was an American serial killer convicted of murdering 2 women in Florida and California in 1995. He was also a suspect in numerous other murders across several states, and notably made unsubstantiated claims of involvement in the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Born in 1962, Rogers had a troubled upbringing and a history of arrests. He was known for his charm, which he used to lure victims, typically women he met in bars. His confirmed murder spree began in September 1995 in California, followed by a murder in Florida in November 1995. He was also suspected in other slayings in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Ohio. Rogers was captured in Kentucky in November 1995 after a high-speed chase. He was convicted in Florida in 1997 and in California in 1999, receiving death sentences in both states. He spent nearly 30 years on death row in Florida. On May 15, 2025, Glenn Edward Rogers was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. According to prison officials, he woke up at 3:45 a.m. and was described as compliant throughout the day. He had one visitor, his wife. For his last meal, Rogers requested and was given pizza, chocolate cake, and soda. His execution was delayed for several hours due to last-minute appeals to the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, which argued that sexual abuse suffered as a child should have been considered during sentencing and raised concerns about the lethal injection drugs. These appeals were ultimately denied. As he was strapped to the gurney in the death chamber, Rogers made a final statement that was reported to include a message for President Trump and an address to victims' families. He said, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure." He then added, "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." He also reportedly thanked his wife. The execution by lethal injection commenced. Glenn Edward Rogers was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. at the age of 62.